Hi, and welcome to Is That Even Constitutional? This is a show where we use the lens of the Constitution to dissect current events. My name's Sadhana Devaraja, and I'm not a constitutional scholar, but lucky for me, my good friend Ken Thomas is. Hi, Ken. How are you?
Great. How are you, Sadhana?
I'm doing well. And this is our second season, which we're calling the Project 2026 series. This is our second proposal of an arc where we're setting forth 10 winnable proposals that would help us reclaim the Constitution through legislation. And today, we're going to focus on the right to equal representation and are proposing to have no more gerrymandering. So before we get kicked off, I'll just kind of do my first question, actually, to Ken, which is what is the difference between reapportionment, which I believe is in the Constitution, redistricting, which is, I'm in California, it's going to be on our ballot on Tuesday in a special election, and gerrymandering, which we're talking about today?
So, good question, Sadhana. The thing we have to start with is the idea that all congressmen from the House of Representatives are elected in single-member districts. Now, that's not in the Constitution, but that is something that federal law provides. So rather than having statewide elections for numerous members, instead we just have single congressional districts for single members to run in. So the process of apportionment occurs after the decennial census. There's a census every 10 years, and those years that end with zero. And after that census, the Congress decides how many seats are going to be given to each state. The number of seats are set by statute, and so what happens every 10 years is some states will lose a couple seats and other states will gain them. That is apportionment. That is how you determine how many seats a particular state is going to have. Now, if you think about that, that in and of itself would be a problem for a state with certain congressional districts because they would have to add congressional districts. So redistricting is the act of determining where you're going to draw the lines once you've been given all the number of state representatives that you're going to have. Now, in some states, their number of representatives aren't going to change. In theory, they could leave their congressional district lines the same. And sometimes that happens. But what also is possible to do is something that we will call, for the colloquial term, which is gerrymandering, which is where the districts are done in such a way as to favor one political party over the other. So apportionment gives you the number of seats a state is going to get, and then districting or redistricting tells you where you're going to draw the lines to create all of those single-member congressional districts.
Okay, and then gerrymandering is when the redistricting happens, but you're favoring one party over the other. And you mentioned the census happening on all years that end with a zero. I remember the 2020 census with COVID hitting. There was a pause and kind of an extension during that time. It was kind of a big deal because with COVID, it was harder to actually get the census done. So that just kind of brought me back to that. So if you're...
And I should say too that it's not always easy for states to get through this. So sometimes states will have a hard time getting a agreed upon decision to the legislature. Sometimes the courts get involved. So sometimes it's not easy, even if you have a census that kind of gets through and gets done on time. So you're absolutely right. Something like this, the delay in the census would delay this whole process and make it more difficult moving forward.
Yeah. And so when they're doing this, which is already like a complex process that you're talking about, how do folks redraw district lines to favor one party over another?
Well, so the terminology is called cracking and packing, which is essentially the idea that cracking means that you identify areas where you have more of one political party than another. So, for instance, say you had an urban area that was predominantly Democrat. So a way to essentially dilute the vote of the individuals in the city or of the Democrats in the city would be to crack them. So you would split those populations into perhaps the suburbs, which might lean more Republican. So by cracking a Democratic population, you can reduce their ability to elect any Democrats by putting them into districts that are specifically designed to lessen the number of Democrats. Now, the idea of packing is a little different. That is the idea that, say, you have an urban center that is predominantly Democrat, well, you might just draw a congressional district around that urban center, leaving all of the suburban districts around, if it works out this way, to be given to be more Republican, and that way the Republicans might be able to win it. Now, obviously, this all varies tremendously depending on exactly where your data shows your Democrats and Republicans are. Now, there is pretty much great data that is publicly available talking about and showing you where Democrats and Republicans, registered Democrats and Republicans, are. And so it is very possible to go through this process and to crack and pack in a way to maximize the number of people who are elected from any one party. And obviously, if one party dominates the redistricting process, such as they control both the House and the Senate in that state and the governorship, then they could probably be very efficient at cracking and packing. And both of these can be used in the same redistricting in order to reach a particularly significant change in the way that people are elected. So, for instance, in North Carolina, in I believe it's the 2022 delegation, was the result of a redistricting where an essentially even 7-7 split between Republicans and Democrats was tilted 10-4 in favor of the Republicans in a state that is pretty much split down the middle in terms of Republicans and Democrats. So obviously, packing and cracking can give you a very significant change in outcome in redistricting process.
And I feel like I know some people may have never heard of gerrymandering, but I feel like more recently I've been hearing about gerrymandering, maybe in like the last 20 years. And so have we always been gerrymandering in this country?
Again, that's a great question. So the term itself, gerrymandering, is actually a historical term. It comes from a election that happened under the governorship of a founding father. It was Governor Gerry who oversaw or was part of a process where a salamander-like district was created among a number of other districts that were drawn, and the salamander was an unusually bizarrely shaped district that managed to capture all sorts of different Democratic. At that point, it was actually it was a fusion party between Democrat and Republican fusion party, but it gave that party an advantage by drawing these very odd-looking districts. And that one, because it looked like a salamander, we now have something called gerrymandering. So there was gerrymandering all the way back to the beginning of this country. However, it was not that common an occurrence. By the 19th century, or should I say by the 20th century, essentially gerrymandering had stopped occurring in any really significant way, at least in redistricting in between censuses. Of course, with each census, there was a certain amount of gerrymandering. So there always has been gerrymandering, but what has happened more recently is that we have had the advent of big data, where now we know exactly where everybody is, computer programs which can be used to cast all sorts of different geographical shapes and to capture the people in different configurations to see how it's going to work out, and essentially a determination to maximize the ability of one party to dominate over the others. While there has always been gerrymandering, it has gotten much more significant and much more effective in slanting elections away from one party into another one.
So I guess this modern era of gerrymandering is much more efficient because of the intricate computer algorithms and detailed data like you had mentioned. And so is it effective?
Well, I think the best example of that is the use of gerrymandering to protect incumbents. Now, this is a slightly different problem in that it's not so much leaning in direction of one Republican or another, but it's more set in the direction of keeping those people who are already in safe congressional seats to basically keeping in those seats. And for instance, in California, I think there's actually been, for years previous to this, were efforts by both parties to come to agreements where gerrymandering would be used essentially to protect incumbents. Gerrymandering has become so efficient in protecting incumbents that in the 2022 election, apparently there were only 4 congressional challenges that were won against incumbents, just giving you an example of just how efficient it has become in at least that context.
Yeah, and so, you talked about the census being kind of the crux for apportionment and reapportionment and bit of redistricting. Can gerrymandering happen more than once a decade?
Yes, it can. It was historically the case that there were some states that did mid-census gerrymandering. However, that really went out of practice for about a century until the case of Texas. So Texas, in the year, I believe it was 2003, decided that even though they had just gerrymandered for the previous census, that they were going to gerrymander again. The entire gerrymandering process, the redistricting process, was essentially overseen by Congressman Thomas DeLay, who was majority leader at the time. He flew to Austin, Texas, went to the state capitol, and essentially entered into negotiations with the various House and Senate offices and was seen walking from office to office carrying electoral maps. And by the time he was done, the Texas legislature had dramatically changed the process of elections in that at that point there were actually more Democrats in the delegation from Texas. And after that, there were twice as many Republicans in the delegation. And so it was one of the more extreme examples of gerrymandering. And it was done essentially in between censuses. Now, it has not been the case that since that there have been a lot of redistricting in between censuses, but what has just most recently happened is President Trump has called for all Republican-led states to gerrymander and to redistrict before the next election, which clearly does not have a relationship to the census, but is essentially just being advocated for partisan purposes. And so Texas, Missouri, a number of other Republican-led states, and potentially going forward, California, have essentially gone towards redistricting, and a number of other states are considering it. So we have gone from a situation where interim redistricting between census were uncommon to where now it seems like every state that has an opportunity may well take the opportunity to redistrict before this next election, which is completely unprecedented.
Yeah, and also it feels remarkable that it's being kind of called for by the executive branch to have that kind of redrawing of maps before the next election cycle. So that feels remarkable too. Is this unconstitutional though? Is partisan gerrymandering unconstitutional?
Well, that's a question we really didn't know the answer for years. There were numerous challenges to redistricting, whether they were because they were mid census or because they were just so clearly skewed in the favor of one party or another. And the cases were considered by a number of lower courts, and some lower courts did find that partisan gerrymandering could be so extreme as to be unconstitutional. One of the main objections being that it violated equal protection because it was diluting votes and was keeping people from really having their votes having the possibility of being counted. The Supreme Court, however, not that long ago, just a few years ago, decided that partisan gerrymandering was not a reviewable decision by the courts. So essentially what they did is they said that we couldn't come up with a reason or a test to determine what would be the proper amount of gerrymandering, because obviously everybody has to redistrict and everybody has to take in considerations of geography or history, et cetera, in order to decide where the districts are. So the court found that there were no standards that could be articulated that would give the courts the ability to reconsider a partisan gerrymandering. And so essentially the Supreme Court said, that's it. We're going to leave this process entirely up to the states and or Congress. And if we do that, then there is essentially no answer to whether or not it's constitutional, or we're leaving the decision as to constitutionality up to the other branches of government.
And so if the courts are saying they can't answer this question, it's a political question and it's up to the states or Congress, can Congress fix this problem?
Yes, Congress can fix this problem. Congress has in the past been involved with redistricting. It was not for very long. It was a period of time where Congress would, when they apportioned and when redistricting was happening, they would establish standards for continuity, to the idea that the districts had to touch each other, they had to fit within a certain amount of non-bizarre looking shapes. And they had to be roughly proportionate in their how many people were included in each population center. And consequently, there is probably no doubt that Congress can step in. This is based on the power of Congress to regulate and to establish the manner of elections for the House of Representatives, something that is in the Constitution. So the only question is, will they and can they move forward on this? So H.R. 1, which was a proposal that the Democrats, when the Democrats were in charge of the House of Representatives, passed, was a bill that had a number of election law procedures in it. But one thing that it had was a requirement that redistricting be done using independent electoral commissions. Now, independent electoral commissions are something that is already used in a number of states, and these are essentially commissions that are set up to be specifically nonpartisan, to draw the lines without a partisan bent. And this is done in a number of ways, possible ways. It can be based on choosing who's going to be on the commission. It could be half Republicans, half Democrats. You could put independents on there, or in some cases, you can just deny the commission the information necessary to identify who the Democrat and Republican voters are in particular states. So there are many ways to set up the independent commissions, but this is the proposal of H.R. 1, was the idea that the redistricting would be done, but it would be done once a census. There would be no midterm or mid-census redistricting, and it would be done by an independent commission that would not do it for a partisan advantage. So it is something that seems to be within Congress's authority.
Yeah. And I just want to underscore this is H.R. 1 from 2021, as you mentioned, when Democrats had majority, not H.R. 1 of this year, which I know in my circles is being talked about a lot because of like the benefits cuts that happened yesterday on November 1st and other things. So H.R. 1 from 2021 is when those proposals were put forth. And so you talked about, some of the harms of gerrymandering a bit, like, it protects incumbents and it, there's this like cracking and packing that happens that feels like against the intent. But like, what are some of the further harms of gerrymandering? Why should we care?
Well, I think the reason we should care is actually very apparent to most people. Gerrymandering is incredibly unpopular. At least 70% of Americans don't like it, and there's a reason they don't like it. It's because in many elections, people know that if they go to vote, that they are going to be unlikely to be able to change the member of the House of Representatives, regardless of how that person has voted, how they have behaved, whether or not they're representing the interests of the district that they're in. It is a very obvious and frustrating thing for many people to realize that their vote probably does not matter in that election and probably will not matter going into the future for that election because incumbents are so well protected. So I think that the problem with gerrymandering is that it very much discourages people from thinking they can change the political process. And if you make people think that even though we have a democracy and even though we have free elections, if you make people think that they really don't have a lot of influence, that their opinion does not matter, that everybody's going to go forward in the House of Representatives, regardless of what the individual voters think, that leads to some very, very negative ideas about democracy. Democracy is actually on the ropes in many places in the world, and to some extent in this country, where it is not working as well as people would like it to, and people feel very frustrated, and they feel very disillusioned, and they feel very disenfranchised. So I think that this is an example of something that everybody knows it's a problem, and everybody doesn't like it. And the reason that it still exists is because it serves the politicians' interests and not the people's interests. And so I think it's actually one of our most obvious examples for a fix that would be important, not just for the popularity of it, but also for the influence it would have on really uprighting our democratic system so that people actually have faith again in the institutions of government.
Thanks so much, Ken. And so I think with that, we'll kind of close out here. I think the main things we heard today are that, gerrymandering, like all of the 10 proposals in this series, is deeply unpopular, that gerrymandering has been stopped before. So we think it can be stopped again. There are levers that Congress has used before and can use again to stop it, and that gerrymandering undermines democracy, and removing gerrymandering returns the democratic process back to the people. So thanks for walking us through that, Ken. I hope listeners are, if you're enjoying the content, please like, subscribe, leave us comments, and let us know that you're liking it. If you would like to hear more about anything, please let us know in comments as well. And also, please feel free to email us. We'd love to hear from you all. And we can be reached at production@constitutionpod.com. Thanks so much. Thanks for listening. Thanks, Ken.
Thanks, Sadhna.